at me, 2 for 10. Damn.
I have something in my mind. I want something.
Loyalty is a characteristic not often seen in the modern NBA. Often players are going to seek a big payday or a place that they feel is a better situation for them to go and win championships. And so many star players are very, very quick to jump the ship and move off of the team that developed them and created the star that they have become, that adapted them to the NBA and placed trust in them. But sometimes that player doesn't ever want to leave. They don't voice concerns. They don't request a trade off of the team, request to be cut. But sometimes the NBA as a business can change your life even when it comes down to factors outside of your control. Welcome back to State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts, and today we're talking about the homecoming of Karl-Anthony Towns. We have to start back in 2015 when Karl-Anthony Towns is selected number 1 overall by the Minnesota Timberwolves. His best friend actually went number 2 in D'Angelo Russell, which is something to keep in mind for later. Russell was lucky enough to go to the Los Angeles Lakers, a franchise with a storied history that still featured perhaps the best Laker ever in Kobe Bryant. While Cat goes to the opposite. He goes to a franchise that has hardly ever seen success outside of prime Kevin Garnett. And he is expected to be the big man that they draft with that number 1 pick to go in there and change the culture of this team, whether that is fair or not. And in his first year in Minnesota, he averages 18 points and 10.5 rebounds. Those numbers would continue to improve and be even more impressive, becoming a 25-point-per-game scorer in just his second year in the NBA. And for his first 5 years in Minnesota, Karl-Anthony Towns has the green light. He has the keys to the city. The offense is tailored towards Cat. He is their homegrown talent that they plan to build around. And they don't experience much success. They have one playoff year in 2018, although that Timberwolves team would ultimately end in controversy with Jimmy Butler calling out the team's starters, and Cat in particular for kind of being soft and not truly caring about winning. Now, the thing to note about Cat at this point in his career is that, yes, he is not really seen as a winning player. But what he is, at this point at least, is a revolutionary offensive center. His ability to shoot the ball at his size is almost unmatched. And he is already in discussions as the best shooting big man of all time alongside Dirk Nowitzki. Now, Dirk is widely seen as the best shooting big ever, but at that center position, it's largely seen as Cat, while Dirk can be the power forward. So to be in conversations with Dirk already, that's huge. And it shows off Cat's unique play style. And that is the play style that Minnesota is building around. But to this point, it's not to much success. And in the 2019-20 season, they make a trade for Warriors point guard D'Angelo Russell. At this point in his career, D'Lo is a one-time All-Star and has had a very up-and-down career. He started off in LA, where he was quite inefficient. Then he goes to Brooklyn and is given the keys to that city, becomes the number 1 option there, and is an all-star, and leads the Nets to a playoff berth. Then he goes to the Golden State Warriors and produces very well in the absence of an injured Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, but ultimately the Warriors don't want to move on from either of those guys. So they ship D'Lo out over to Minnesota, and now Cat is reunited with his best friend. And this is a move that was clearly done with the intention of keeping Cat happy. because D'Lo, as good as a player as he can be, he is quite inconsistent, and he can raise a floor of a team like we saw with the Brooklyn Nets, but he is not necessarily one that is going to raise your ceiling, and that's what the Timberwolves really need, because at this point, both these guys are not seen as the highest caliber of winning players, especially due to injuries that they both suffered at this point. But then comes the 2020 draft. The Timberwolves have the number 1 pick, and they select Anthony Edwards. And this is where a shift in the keys of the offense to Minnesota occurs. Also worth noting here is that they go and they draft Jaden McDaniels in the first round as well. And the year prior to that, the Timberwolves signed an undrafted big man who had a similar play style to Cat in Naz Reid. And in Ant's rookie year, particularly the first half of it, the keys of the offense still belong to both Cat and D'Angelo Russell. Those are the go-to guys on offense for the Minnesota Timberwolves. And Anthony Edwards, at this point in his career, does not look like he's really that deserving of the number 1 pick. But in the second half of the year, he begins to up his game and starts really competing with who was really perceived as the runaway victor to start off the year for the Rookie of the Year award in LaMelo Ball. And Anthony Edwards goes and makes it a conversation into the season, averaging 19 points. And now, all of a sudden, there's a shift in the dynamic of the Minnesota Timberwolves, because now Anthony Edwards is taking more shots, and he's becoming more confident in doing so. At the same time, fellow draftee Jaden McDaniels is getting into that rotation, playing 63 games in the 2020 season, and Naz Reid is defining his own role as well. Now, looking at Naz Reid, this is a big man who has a very similar skill set to Karl-Anthony Towns. But early on as a player, he was not confident at all in his abilities. But over time, Minnesota Timberwolves fans would develop an attachment to him, as they rooted for him to grow more confidence as a player and be confident in his abilities and take more shots. In Anthony Edwards' year 2 of his career, he's up to 21 points a night. And the biggest knock on him at this point right now is that he's not a great defender. And that's not a good thing for this Minnesota Timberwolves and their perceived big three of D'Angelo Russell, Cat, and Anthony Edwards, because all three of those guys at this point, especially for Cat and D'Lo at least, are kind of defensive liabilities. Ant has shown some flashes, but has not put it all together. But in year 3 of the Anthony Edwards experiment, he's up to 24 points a night. So not only is Anthony Edwards taking up the helm on the offensive end, but he's really showing his potential as a defender. And the same can be said for his fellow 2020 draftee, Jaden McDaniels. Another big addition to that defense is Rudy Gobert, a big man who is the opposite of everything that Karl-Anthony Towns does. He is a rim protector first and foremost, and anything that he does on offense is secondary and mainly rim running. But the Timberwolves, they want to experiment with both Cat and Gobert. But in this 2022 season, Cat deals with some injuries. And at the trade deadline, they trade D'Angelo Russell, Cat's best friend, in favor of Mike Conley, who is a guy who has played with Rudy Gobert before instead, and knows how to tailor his offensive game and his passing prowess to the benefit of Rudy Gobert, as opposed to D'Lo, who had more chemistry with Cat. That first year of the Gobert experiment doesn't go very well. Timberwolves are the 8th seed, but it looks like the guy for this team that is emerging is Anthony Edwards, because he looks real good in the playoffs. And the next year, the Timberwolves go on, and they're the number 3 seed. Anthony Edwards is the solidified franchise guy for this team. And Naz Reid, this big man with a very similar skill set to Karl-Anthony Towns, is sitting behind both Cat and Gobert and relegated to a bench role. But he goes out and he wins Sixth Man of the Year, looking like one of the best bench players in the entire league, especially as an offensive big man. And Jaden McDaniels looks like a great defender as well. He makes an all-defensive team. And the Timberwolves go on to make the Western Conference Finals. Now, Cat does not have a bad playoff run this year, but in years prior, it felt like his playoff performances, lackluster ones, had kind of held the team back. And Anthony Edwards averages about 30 points a game in the playoffs. Nas Reed has some good moments too. And Rudy Gobert, the biggest knock on him was for his playoff performances because he is an elite rim protector. But when he was on the Utah Jazz prior to Minnesota, he would get attacked defensively and get schemed out on the perimeter because the Jazz had no other real capable defenders to help play alongside Gobert. But now in Minnesota, you've got Anthony Edwards. You've got Jaden McDaniels. You've got a lot of scrappy perimeter defenders on this team. And Gobert can operate in his bread and butter in the post and not be a weak link of the defense like he was in the playoffs for Utah. Now the Timberwolves say they have to pay Nas Reed, they have to pay Jaden McDaniels. And these are the young guys who are still up and coming and still not the best version of themselves, despite the great production and the great impact that they've had on the game already. And to get Rudy Gobert, they traded a lot of assets, so they can't move off of him either. But this is a lot of money to have in 4 guys, and especially because your big 3 of the future is seen now as McDaniel, as Nas Reed, as Anthony Edwards. Those are the real fundamental pieces to build around at this point. And that leaves one odd man out, and that is Karl-Anthony Towns. Despite playing in Minnesota for 9 years now, he is on his way out of the city because they can't pay everyone, and they feel like Karl-Anthony Towns is the easiest decision to move on from. And now Cat goes to MSG, the world's most famous arena. He is a New York Knick. He slowly saw his offensive role decrease in Minnesota as Anthony Edwards took the reins. Nas Reed developed to have a very similar play style to Cat, and the Wolves felt as though he could replace at least 90% of Cat's production. And Cat and Jaden McDaniels, they looked like much better defenders and playoff performers. So as a result, these were the guys with perhaps less question marks and higher ceilings in terms of how they can impact the game on the court, especially come playoff time. And the Wolves go with those, and they trade Cat away to New York. And for the Knicks, Cat is having one of his best seasons ever. Back up to 25 points per game, his highest mark since 2019-20 season. He is shooting 53% from field, and as a center, shooting 46% from beyond the arc, solidifying his claim as the best shooting center ever. And on December 19th, it's the homecoming of Karl-Anthony Towns. He is going back to Minnesota, the team that felt like they had better options than him. And he scores 32 points on 5 of 5 from three-point land and gets 20 rebounds against the Timberwolves team that chose the rim protector over him. Cat gets 20 boards. And it looks like he has found his place once again, but this time in New York. And when he was in Minnesota, Cat meant so much to the community. There was at one point where, he was the guy that they had drafted and they had developed and saw come into his own. But the Timberwolves, they liked their shiny new toys. And as time went on, Cat was seen as a less and less valuable member of the team. Despite everything that he meant to the city, despite all the charitable contributions that he made, Cat wasn't deemed, on the business side of things, as worth keeping around. But in his first season with the New York Knicks, he has looked like a perfect fit for that team. Really been the center that they needed in the absence of Mitchell Robinson and more. And showed the Timberwolves what they were missing out on by being perhaps the best version of himself that we have ever seen. And he looks more confident too, having more ball handling duties than we saw in Minnesota when most of those went to Anthony Edwards. And when they did go to Cat, it didn't flow as smoothly as it is in New York right now. And in having this 30-20 game against Minnesota, while Minnesota is having a very disappointing season compared to where they were just a year prior with Cat on the team, Karl-Anthony Towns really showed all the talent and all that he has to offer as an NBA player and how valuable that he can be. That was all on display in his homecoming against the Minnesota Timberwolves. And that is all for today's episode of State of the Association. Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Nash Roberts.